Okay, so look, I've just been introduced as the immediate past CEO of PBB, Parents Beyond Breakup. Some of you may know us as dads in distress or mums in distress. So we look after dads who are separated and mums. Those are our two frontline services, but the overall charity is called Parents Beyond Breakup. Now, look, I've come back as an ambassador to speak on behalf of the organization, but also to head up special projects. And the project that you guys are all working on in Southwest Sydney, we are also working on that with you. And we'll be running peer groups for men in the Southwest Sydney region. So I'll be heading up that project as the past CEO. Okay, so by way of context, some of you may know who Dads in Distress are or were, or how we operate, but for those that don't, very quickly, the organization started out as Dads in Distress, which later became a frontline service of a renamed Parents Beyond Breakup. But Dads in Distress started in 1999 in Coffs Harbour by a guy called Tony Miller. He later won an OAM in recognition for his wonderful work in suicide prevention. Today, we are comprised of about 20 groups across the country, pretty much spread across every major conurbation. So every major city has a few. And we also have online groups as well. They run weekly, and they're based around a model which Tony developed back in '99. Now, Tony, like myself, was a guy who went through a pretty difficult, traumatic separation. Like myself, he had access to doctors, GP, psychs, counselors. If when he was depressed, he was given the drugs that he needed to help him handle his situation. But he felt that he wasn't getting the help that he needed. So he advertised in the local papers and said, "I'll be sitting on my veranda in Coffs Harbour on Father's Day, 1999. And if any other dads want to come along and sit with me, just share a drink, a cup of tea, cup of coffee, a beer, and just chat." Well, a load turned up. It then went on to local community radio. Other groups started appearing in the Coffs Harbour area. And the next thing you know, it went national. And at the height of the organization, probably about 10 years ago, we actually had something like 50 groups running around Australia. So it might seem that we've actually shrunk down to 20, but like every organization, I'm sure you guys are going through it as well, you become a bit more professional, you become a little bit organized, and you realize that some of the groups that are out there are a little bit chaotic, doing their own thing, not quite doing the same thing as the rest of us. So we've kind of become much more focused about what we do, so fewer groups. So he tapped into something that was desperately needed that wasn't being provided by, in inverted commas, the professionals. And that's a man to sit next to me to listen to the issue that I'm dealing with. And again, a lot of you will know what it means to go through a separation as a man with children. Not least that we often kind of joke around the fact that it's hard to find anyone these days that either hasn't experienced it themselves or they have someone in their circle, whether it's a friend, a work colleague, or a family member that has gone through it. So most people have a sense of what it means to go through a separation with a child as a man. But for those that are not so familiar with some of the dynamics, a couple of things are really interesting to share around this subject. The first is that it's probably the single biggest social determinant of suicide in the Western world. And that's pretty consistent across most westernized countries. Here in Australia, as I'm sure anyone that's been following the US election overnight will know, you can get one set of numbers and two completely different opinions on what it means. But depending on how you look at the numbers from the ABS, you can consider that of those suicides in Australia that are known to be linked to a social determinant, 42% are men going through separation, and every other known group is successively smaller. So it's likely, that doesn't account for all suicides because we don't know what all suicides are caused by or linked to, but we can say with some confidence that separating men are probably one of the major categories. And certainly when you look at some of the subcategories of things like substance abuse or homelessness or financial issues, quite often they are prompted originally by a relationship breakdown. And certainly some of the data that's come out of Beyond Blue quite recently and Mission Australia is that 62% of homelessness in Australia is actually linked to family breakdown originally. So it's quite a big problem. And Tony Miller had tapped into it and he discovered something quite interesting in terms of what these men needed. So look, I mean, that's a little bit about the organization. I won't say too much more around that other than consider that the unique thing about separating men and suicide is that if you think about the common drivers of suicide, things like I've lost my home, I don't have any money, I've lost my purpose in life, I've lost a loved one, those are commonly well understood precursors of extreme trauma that leads potentially to suicide. Family separation, particularly where it's a dad and he loses access to his children, is uniquely a combination of all of them and almost instantaneously. And I'll talk a little bit about that with my own case. It can happen to mums as well, and increasingly so. So the family law system is problematic. There are continual inquiries. I'm not going to comment on the politics of it. The longer I work in this area, the more I realize it is a nightmare, and it is very difficult to come out with any one answer that makes any sense to an outsider. But what I will say is that it is possible to play games inside the family court, and men do it as much as women do. Um, but we would say it's 80-20 in terms of who loses out on the kids. 80% of the time, it's typically the men that lose out on the kids, 20%, it's the mums. For the mums going through it, it's equally as bad, if not worse, because society is pretty tough on women that lose access to their kids. It's never without reason, in inverted commas, in the eyes of everyone else. And it might actually be just because the dad, in that case, is not a particularly nice person, has said some pretty awful things which are not true, and he's managed to get separated from the kids. It happens both ways. I just want to underline that right here. But the bulk is the dads that we deal with. So the challenges are a tsunami, a perfect tsunami of multiple problems. So homelessness, financial problems, um, loss of access to family members, loss of social circle, if you have allegations against you which are unproven, but they have an impact on your personal life. So it's all at once. And then secondly, just to compound that, it's an unusual group because typically that group of guys, they are men who are fighting in the family courts to see their children. And one of the ways you prevent the other parent getting access to the child is to make false allegations against them. Quite often, he's crazy, he's violent, he's got mental health problems. So the last thing you can do as a traumatized man who's lost everything and doesn't have a support network is to go out to your doctor and say, I have mental health problems, because then the courts can use that as a reason to not let you see your kids. So you have this double problem of you have a perfect tsunami of problems and you are too scared to ask for help. And that's certainly something that happened in my case. If I just touch upon very quickly my story, that I actually went to my doctor after 5 or 6 years and said, look, I'm depressed, I can't cope anymore, I'm suicidal. That appeared because my medical notes were subpoenaed into the court. And the next thing I know, they said a suicidal man cannot have access to his child under any circumstances. So I learned a very harsh lesson. I cannot ask for help. So one of the reasons peer support works and is so powerful is it's another man like me. It's not a doctor or an official. It's another guy who sits next to me. And that for the first time, I can actually talk openly about what I'm going through. So I could talk for hours about this. So let's talk a little bit about my situation. I think that's something that Ian asked me to do. Got to be a little careful about what I say on this one. You could probably tell from my accent, I come from the UK. So my story really is one of, I was with my former wife for 14 years before we got married. But at the point we got married in 2001, we actually had a 5-year-old daughter. And rather unusually, not that I'd planned it that way, for those 5 years leading up to us getting married with a 5-year-old daughter, I'd actually become the main carer. It's not something I'd ever planned or thought about, but my wife worked in the city, had a very high level job. She's brilliant at it. So she wanted to go back to work. I worked as a psychologist at the time, and so I could work from home. So I ended up being, in inverted commas, mum. That's quite an important aspect to understand here, because quite often when we think about custodial issues around children, we assume that the courts continue the status quo versus look at the genders, but they do assume that the mother is the carer and the father isn't. So when we did separate, the child would consider me to be the primary parent, but the child was not given the option, and neither was I, because I was a male. Things have improved since then, and certainly in Australia, it's better than it was 20 years ago, back in 2001 in the UK. So certainly things have improved, but not significantly. We still have the same problem. So we separated. I found out the hard way. In my case, I had a client which I had to go see in the city. during the day. We had an au pair. We were lucky enough to be relatively wealthy, and so we had an au pair living in with us, and she looked after the kid, the daughter for us. And when I came back from work late that evening, the house had been emptied. And this is something that in the States and the UK we refer to as hoovering, where your house is cleaned for you whilst you go out to work, and you come back and literally there's nothing. And it was a psychological message to me. Obviously this is recorded, so I'll use my words carefully, but it was like a screw you, because it was a single mattress, a knife and fork and a plate, and that was all that was left in the house. And I didn't realize at the time what I had done to upset her, because we hadn't had a discussion about it, but we ended up splitting suddenly. So you come home, you're in shock, you don't know what's going on, so you try and ring your other half, and obviously she's hearing the messages at her end, or hearing my calls, at which point she initiated the police. And then the police turned up and promptly issued me with something that the Brits call an NMO, which is equivalent of in Australia an AVO or an IVO or a DVO, but it's a domestic violence order. And it was the strangest experience for someone like me, because there was no allegation of any domestic violence. It was the fear that there might be a reprisal, because I was so angry at what had been done to me. So the next thing you know is I have this order that says I can't go within 250 meters of my home, my child, or my wife. And my circle of friends, of course, I spoke to them and said, what the hell is this? What do I do about this? I've never experienced it. The next thing you know, everyone starts assuming that you're violent and that you're aggressive. And then the courts started acting in the same way as soon as I wanted to see my daughter. So I guess I'm giving you a little bit of a picture of how these problems sort of compound one on top of another, because of the kind of ideological approach we have to how we deal with the man and the woman in the case of a separation. So you don't necessarily have to have done anything. You just need to be in fear that an individual might do something, and that's enough. And including in Australia under current legislation to issue an AVO or a DVO against someone. And it's a problem we see in our groups on an almost daily basis, where guys come in, occasionally mums in the mums groups, but they'll come in and they'll say they've just been issued this, they have no idea what it means. And quite often they will, unfortunately, not understanding it, break it accidentally, and then end up in prison. We were told by the head of the prison service in Victoria about 3 years ago that anything up to 25% of inmates in Victoria were purely breaches of domestic violence orders. And to give you a sense of what that means, I can get let's say an AVO or a DVO. I do nothing. I don't contact my ex-partner. She contacts me and says, can we calm it down? Can we organize about you seeing the kids? And I respond back and say, yes, my order is that I'm ordered by the state not to have any contact. By saying yes, or responding to her, I can now go for prison for 3 months. It's a very common tactic that lawyers will use both ways. This is not an anti-female thing. It can be used both ways. It's a very common problem. So you can see how these problems compound very fast. They're horrible to deal with, and you need really good advice pretty quickly. So look, I went through a period of shock. I'm just going to wrap this up quickly for this first half, but went rapidly through a period of shock, quickly burnt through all the money that I had and all the credit that I had access to in order to fight this in the family courts, very similar to here. And then ended up not having any money. So I became bankrupt. I didn't have a home. The home was sold by the family courts without my permission. And the money was given 100% to my other half because she had to start up a new life. It was actually handed to the child in effect, but the custodian of the child was the mother. So I ended up with zero. Couldn't get any help from the state because I'm a man. The only thing they could offer me was a hostel, which was a halfway house kind of thing with people that had just come out of prison, or people with, you know, serious mental health problems that, you know, they didn't have the services to look after them anywhere else, or had substance abuse problems. So there I am in that hostel. It's very frightening, and there's not a cat's open hell that I can bring a child into that environment. It's too scary. So I ended up sofa surfing, I think you'd call it. In Britain here, you might call it lounge surfing, sleeping on friends' sofas, but that can only last for so long. So, cut a long story short, Twice I got to the point of such desperation that I actually tried to take my life. As you can probably tell from the fact I'm talking to you, I'm pretty bad at that. It's not one of my life skills, if you can excuse the inadvertent pun. And I'm pleased that I'm still here now, because I'm no longer feeling that way and I get on with my ex. But I got into activism. So there's a few photos there of me, just a few select ones, to give you a sense of the kind of trouble I got myself into in the UK. Arrested quite a few times. Protested quite a bit, the strong sense of injustice, and certainly that's one of the things that we come across with dads so often today that we're dealing with. They come to our groups and they are in shock, they're traumatized, they're distressed, and they're angry. And their anger is understandable. It's a normal reaction to an abnormal situation. And certainly in my case, top right, you can see that I actually did a hunger strike. It's about the only time I've actually been relatively fit looking in my entire life. Did a hunger strike outside the Prime Minister's house in 2011, and it led to me actually getting access to my daughter after 10 years. She eventually came to live with me. I won full custodial care, and we came to Australia in 2012. So that's my story. But I just wanted to give you an insight into, if you're not aware of it, the kind of nightmare that you can actually face when you're in this situation, how quickly things can get very, very bad, very, very fast. And there's no logic to it. And there's very few people that can help you understand how to deal with it, other than family lawyers, who, in the modern context here in Australia, you could be paying $500–600 an hour. And you're talking about years and years worth of intensive work of many hours per week. So 2017, I did a bit of study with 400 of our dads, and the average spend across those 400 dads at different stages, some of them had dealt with their case, was $279,000. So that gives you an insight into what it's like to be on the receiving end of, it's almost kind of like, it feels like blackmail. I can't get access to my kid, and the only way I can do it is to keep forking out money to family lawyers until I can get to see my child. And it's very difficult to do that. So anyway, look, that's an insight into the problem.
The first point that men will probably go to is either the doctor, or they'll be contacted by the police or the legal system. And if there could be some introduction at those pressure points to groups like Mentoring Men or Distressed Men, etc., then that might help, because a lot of people need to understand what options they do have, because it's so rapid and you just don't know what options you have.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Pete, comment on from what Mark said there?
Actually, I think, Mark, you're spot on, and it's something that I've worked very hard on doing on behalf of Parents Beyond Breakup. It's one of the reasons we rebranded, because historically it's been really difficult. If you look, I mean, I think things have changed, so we're in a good time historically right now, particularly in Australia. But there was a time when if you worked with men, you were considered to be a men's rights activist. So even as recently as 2 years ago, we couldn't get family courts or the police to put up a poster for us as a charity dealing with suicide for both mums and dads, because we were considered to be two men's rights, because we looked after men. So I think there is a stigma around that, but you're absolutely right. I think that's the way to go, to get the referrals from those first responders.
And gave a very good point about how when you were talking about the type of help that you got, the type of help, but it was really specific, because your own lived experience is really enormous. But what was the type of help that you liked?
I actually, in fact, Pete, hello, Pete, I don't know whether Pete recognizes me, but yes, I did meet up with Dads in Distress in 2014. And the approach I took was, it was, okay, let me summarize it. It's like when I was told, I'll call the cops, I said, go call the army. I've done nothing wrong. And till date, I've had 2 attempted AVOs, and I came out laughing, and I thought to myself, you try that the 3rd time, trust me, I will sue you for harassment. And the whole approach was, in fact, my dad taught me this when I was a kid. If you've done nothing wrong, care a damn to anybody. Just stay calm and speak when they ask you questions, and you'll be out from there.
And in terms of people listening to you, what type of listening What types of things did they do best? Were you were mentioning about listening to you?
Okay, I had about 3 close friends. One was a brother-in-law. None of them were divorced, but all of them were actually sitting on and giving me their time. I also took on the strategy of doing some research and understanding how to navigate around this mudslinging, and I think that is what worked for me. And my bottom line priority was my 3 kids. I've got a 21-year-old who's now 21. I've got a 13-year-old and a 10-year-old. The 2 boys are with me 40% of the time. But the approach was bring it on, and I will prove who is the troublemaker. And I'll be honest with you, my lawyer's bill was $8,000, gentlemen.
Yep.
The saga lasted for 18 months. He wasn't the best lawyer. He told me very clearly, Alden, I do not like litigation, but I'll navigate you around. And his bill was $8,000 for 18 months. And I continued to get 40% of everything, including the house and my kids.
That's really taking the bull by the horns, Pete. And but having a network of people who are there to talk to you or to support you seemed to be very important there in this case. Not everybody can take the bull by the horns.
Yes, they can't. Well, in fact, look, I was going to touch upon it in the second half, but certainly 72% of people that come to us are sufficiently, look, not a technical term, but sufficiently broken that they are at the point of thinking of taking their life. And they're beyond the point of fighting. I mean, the ones which are really frightening are the ones who are calm. And you know that they're kind of at the point where that's it, I've given up now, I don't care. I'm here just to see if there's any option, but I've given up. And you're right, not everyone is strong. But the only other thing I would like to say is, children, yes, I do remember you. Well done on your situation. And the most important thing is, give us the name of that solicitor, because he's about the cheapest one I've ever heard.
No, he's not in the family law. And but trust me, again, I'm saying this. It doesn't mean you throw money, you will get what you want. Absolutely. Do not drop the money, please.
My situation is that my partner has come from a lesbian relationship, and she was accused of being a danger to the children. She went out to a wedding one night and came back to find the children, and her ex had disappeared. A few days later, police rocked up with an AVO saying that she was a danger to the children and the ex. Fast forward a number of months, and her ex then attacked my partner in her bedroom with a hammer. Ended up in hospital and all that, and this is while the children were in the room next door. So my partner had sent a message before all this sort of stuff, and it was long enough before the attack occurred to say that the 2 incidents are linked. But she said to common friends, look, just letting you know, we're no longer together. If you've got any concerns for the children, here's my phone number. Give me a call. And because of that, she technically breached the AVO, the unjustified, unwarranted, and to date, without evidence. Like, there's literally been no evidence of this. And so she has literally tomorrow, she's in court twice to hopefully try and get the original AVO quashed. But even if it does get quashed, she's still got a criminal charge for breaching that AVO. And she's hoping that that gets turned into just like a community service thing. So she's very likely to end up with a criminal record, which will mean that she'll lose her job and all this sort of stuff. When she was the birth mother, and you know, she's the one who looked after the children. The ex didn't. The ex claimed that she was the violent one, even though she was the one who ended up attacking my partner. So I've come along to these sessions because although she was the one who was attacked, she's the one they are her children. You know, I look at them at a bit of a high level, as you know, I look after them as well. I encourage them, I support them, I nurture them, all that sort of stuff. I would love to see them as my own children, but like I said, she was the one who was attacked, but I still feel as her partner at the time that I failed as a man. You know, she got attacked and I wasn't there to protect her. So when she suffers, I suffer, and so I'm not immediately like others are possibly in this group, but I still feel the pain, if you like. So yeah, that's my story.
Pete, that's a harrowing story, isn't it, of the shortcomings of the legal interpretations in these kind of cases.
It is, and actually, your story is a powerful one. So thank you for sharing that. Not least, it just demonstrates that, you know, it doesn't make a difference whether you're straight or whether you're gay, whether you're male or female. It happens in all directions. And I think, like I shared earlier, in some ways, for a birth mother, it can actually be worse because of the way society then views you. That's an enormous struggle. And one of the things I would say to you, not to take away from where we're going in a moment, but just bear in mind that we have mums in distress. We'd love to help out if we can. And actually, we've just launched a new service called PBB Plus, because we didn't know what to call it, but that's the people around the person who's suffering, because quite often it's easy to forget that of this world are also struggling with this. You're picking up on that stress and experiencing it as well. So we've just set up a group. It's very small to begin with, but we'd love you to be part of that as well if you're interested.
Yeah. I picked up a couple of points as someone interested in approaching these guys. And Adam made a really good point, and I think it should be something we should consider in preparation for mentoring, maybe, is that lived experience is really important. So somebody who has an understanding of the situation that person may be going through, which obviously PBB is really great for, but it's also mentoring. But I also got out of it, Adam, was the knowledge, right? So you're like, part of the anger relates to confusion and fear about what's next, or you know, and so something around resources that are actually able to support a man with some tangible input, you know. So this might be, I'm imagining, might be someone you could, you know, you can get some support for legal issues, or, you know, you could go here for information on how to you know, deal with an AVO, or, you know, here's a legal, here's a financial resource. So something around that, you know, a bit of documentation. I'm sure PBB, you might have some of that stuff already. So, yeah, and then I thought the other thing, the approach needs to be calm, right? So calm, as in, if they're calm, we're worried, but if we're calm, they can maybe relax a bit. So.
I think, John, you made some really interesting points there, and it's spot on. If we look at national statistics, there's a lot of data that's coming out now around suicide, particularly in the last couple of years. And one of them is that approximately 60% of males, 60 to 70% of male suicide is what we would refer to as situational distress linked. It is a particularly traumatic situation. It is not mental health. The minority of male suicide is mental health. The majority of female suicide is mental health. The minority is situational. Now, that's a really important point, because when we talk nationally about we need to deal with people's mental health, yes, that's true. But if you deal with it as a medical issue versus a practical issue, you're not actually addressing the problem. And it might be as simple as, I don't know what an AVO means. And a doctor can't help you with that. Pills will not help you with that. You need somebody to talk you through it. And you may not have the $500 an hour to pay a lawyer for it. So actually sitting in a group with 10 other guys who've been through it at different stages, some of them a little bit old and grizzled like me with gray hair, that can sit there and go, okay, I know what it is. It's not going to kill you. Sit down, shut up, it'll be fine, sort of thing. And you can hold their hand metaphorically. Very, very important. Lastly, yes, we do have contacts, people we can send them to, but we tend not to publish those, because we do have friendly lawyers who give out free work for extreme cases. But if we put it on the website, they probably get 10,000 calls the next day. So we're very careful about who we give those out to.
We're in a situation where our whole court system and so much of what we do is an adversarial system. And leaving aside lawyer jokes, lawyers are very much at the heart of this adversarial system, and they're trained in this culture of this adversarial sort of pit bull type sort of culture. So we have a bloke sort of coming with some of those male stereotypes of being the hero and being the warrior, etc. And suddenly he comes up with this absolute behemoth of a system that's all around adversarial and all about, alpha male. And he doesn't know the system. It's beyond his understanding, and it's even beyond his ability to get into the fight. He's got to rely on other people. I mean, that's got to be one of the most disempowering, disillusioning, and frustrating sort of systems. I'm wondering, Peter, whether, just our whole underlying system is part of that situational distress that, I don't know how you beat it, but, or am I just, off
No, you're quite right.
That?
Look, I mean, I think there are answers to it. I mean, back in the days when, and just to end the first half on a point of clarity, I am 100% against activism now. It was a point in my life, in my situation, where I was very angry, but I learned it doesn't work. Okay, but since then, I've had the pleasure, because of my job, to meet with people like the Chief Justice here in Australia, to have met with prime ministers and former prime ministers and had this discussion at a relatively high level and understood what their perspective on it is. And there are solutions, but it's very, very difficult to get out of the system we have. We have a constitutional right to legal remedy. So, for example, there are solutions that work in the States and in Europe, which is an inquisitorial system versus adversarial, which is where there are no lawyers. It's a judge sitting there and very quickly working out, okay, I believe you, I don't believe you, what's the evidence? And very quickly, whilst it's still raw, organizing what needs to be done, and breaks the pattern of it becoming adversarial and each party getting entrenched very deeply into a fight that neither will give up. So those approaches do work. They've been trialed in the UK, which is an adversarial system, and it worked hugely successfully, and it was killed off by the legal lobby, and because it took away the constitutional right for you to take the other person to court. Because it's an inquisitorial system and our system is adversarial, you have the right to accuse this person and to see your evidence tested in a court. It's very difficult to change anything without changing the constitution, and the industry makes money from it. There are good lawyers and there are bad lawyers, but it's set up in such a way that people make money out of it, and it's very difficult to break that without fundamentally changing your rights. I'm going to have to tread very lightly on this subject because we're limited in terms of time, but I'm very happy today or another time to go into a lot more depth, or if you have any particular questions. But okay, so Dads in Distress, as I mentioned, was started 21 years ago. No expertise was involved in setting it up, but you might consider that being a dad in distress, you're probably pretty aware of what it is that you need, more so than those who are not a dad in distress. So you have a sense of what it is you're looking for. And part of that is the practical solutions, and not necessarily from someone charging you $500 an hour, or from somebody whose answer is, here's a box of pills. Okay, so you want to talk to someone that's going to give you some practical insight that says, I've been there before. There's a very good military joke, which I will not go into because I'm terrible at telling jokes, but it's something to do with a soldier, a squaddy falling into a trench and not being able to get out of it, and an officer walks by and, oh, here I am, I'm telling it now. Officer walks by and the squaddy says, can you help me out? And the officer says, no idea how to do that, sorry, mate. And then another squaddy walks along and the one in the trench says, can you help me get out? And so the squaddy walking by jumps in with him. The one who's stuck there and says, you're an idiot, you've jumped in here now as well, we both can't get out now. And the other one says, no, I've been here before, I know how to get out. So it's a story that kind of talks to you about the power of being a peer. I've walked this road, I know what you're going to go through. I can help you set the expectation of what will happen to you, and yes, you will survive it. Yes, you can do this, and maybe you need to readjust your expectation. That's one of the key things. So look, when we started this off, we didn't have a particularly smart way of doing it. We didn't base it on any ideology or any research. We just had a bunch of guys sitting in a circle. But over 21 years, you learn better, especially when you have 50 groups, you learn that one group works really well and one group doesn't. At some point, we started measuring the performance. We started measuring the suicidality, believe it or not, of guys who came in. And then we asked them the next week, and then we learned which groups are able to turn this around really quickly. And then we learned, okay, we're now learning something. So out of that process over 21 years, we've developed something that works extraordinarily well. And in my tenure, this last 3.5 years, I started looking into this and discovered that what we had done was to put together a group that was an approach that I think is quite famous within the world of psychology through a guy called Carl Rogers from the 1950s and 60s. And it's a particular way of acting in that room. And it's about being the calm person and getting people to reflect on, well, how's that working for you? What are the options in front of you right now? And then others will answer because they know something. But anyway, let me talk to you a little bit about the process of what we actually do. And I'm just summarizing it very quickly. So just to give you a sense of how powerful this is, we deal with somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 men per year. 72% of them will turn up and say that within the last week they have felt suicidal. We know that 80% of those will not feel the same way within one session, within 1 week. And by 3 weeks or 3 sessions, it's 0. I mean, every once in a while, somebody says they're suicidal and we follow up and then they say, oh, I was just waiting to see if anyone was going to contact me. It's quite interesting. It's a very, very good system that works with people who are facing situational distress in this environment, in this particular environment. So what do we know? We know that around 375 suicides each year, based on our research, are prevented by these 20 groups. So it's very powerful. What happens and how does it work? The first thing is it's a weekly group that's either in the local community and it meets for 2 to 3 hours every week, or it's an online group that meets for 2-3 hours and we replicate online what we do in the real world. There is no cost, no booking, and no preparation. Now this we've learned is super, super critical because men we've learned may know about a support service for months before they actually bother to turn up. They'll be in a low place, or they'll have the time, or if they're depressed, they'll suddenly feel the energy and the need to go to the group because something might be pushing them. They might be going to court tomorrow, so they need someone to speak to urgently. So they'll suddenly turn up. So a lot of funded services or official services have some kind of intake program and some process where you need to make bookings and things. We've learned that actually just having a group at a regular time in a regular place where men can just randomly rock up makes an enormous difference. So in that eternal question of how do you make something attractive to men, or how do you make it sticky for men so that they keep coming back to it, it's the no organization, no cost, no hassle, just turn up. That's all you need to do. So it's a little bit like Alcoholics Anonymous. You just turn up to the group. Okay. Once the men are there, we'll get them sat in a circle, shoulder to shoulder. There are no barriers. So typically, we try and avoid having coffee tables or tables in the room. They don't sit around a table. They sit in a circle of chairs. There are no barriers to communication. And, you know, you can look to your left and your right and you can see everyone. And that actually provides a level of psychological safety, which doesn't work the same if you're giving a lecture, for example, to a room of men. So that's quite important. Now we start off with a bit of an introduction, a welcome statement that explains what we do. I'm sure Aldrin will know this from having been, which explains for the new person roughly what happens, and it's a reminder for everyone else. And then after that, we have a 1-minute silence. God forbid you forget as a facilitator that 1-minute silence, those men will string you up. It's a ceremonial thing that becomes very important over the years. It's our little thing where we've had a busy day, we're stressed, we've turned up at the group early evening before we go home, and then there's this minute silence where you go calm and you think about what you're going to say in the first half, which immediately follows that minute silence. It's also a time to commemorate those men who took their lives or don't know that Dads in Distress exists and that they could be there in that circle. Because of that, we always keep one chair empty. And that chair we consider is not, we call it the empty chair, but we consider it to be occupied by the individual that doesn't know or could no longer be with us. So again, another ceremonial thing is, God forbid anyone puts their mobile phone or a cup of coffee on it, everyone else jumps up and strings them up straight away. That chair is occupied, but it's important that we recognize that man that is with us. After that initial 1-minute silence, the facilitator will hand out a rock, a bit like a talking stick, nothing too sophisticated there. And the first half of the meeting is literally everyone taking turns when they're handed the rock to speak for a few minutes. They can say whatever they want. You always listen in silence. There are no questions, no responses, nothing. When they finished, everyone thanks them. And that's quite an important psychotherapeutic element, which is I said something, I can say what I like. The newbies will be left towards the end of the sharing session, so they've learned how it works from the others. They will have heard others who are more experienced, who know that if there's a newbie in the room, I might share with you that I've had false allegations that I don't know, for example, not a real one, but you know, I was accused in court of touching my children inappropriately. And then the new person who's still in shock at having experienced an allegation like that, but was terrified to bring it up, now feels comfortable. So the order in which we share that rock out is critical, and we've learned how to do that. If someone doesn't want to share, that's fine. In the original statement that we make at the beginning of the meeting, we say, if you don't want to say anything, you don't have to. Some people just sit in there and they listen, observe. Next week, they come back and they share. That's the first half. It's psychotherapeutic. I get all my angst out. And sometimes for the new guys, it's the first time they've ever been able to say what's in their heart, because it's the only place they feel safe, that there's no risk. No one's going to accuse me of being a pedophile because of these allegations in court, because 9 out of the 10 guys have experienced it. I mean, sometimes you'll get the new guys like burst out laughing or burst out crying because of the relief. It's almost like, oh my God, you've all had it as well. I can't believe it. So it's a very powerful thing. We have a break. That break itself is actually important. We've learned that natural mentoring occurs because 2 men who are in that room, one might be new, have just been discussing a problem that's similar. I've just been given an AVO. You mentioned you've got an AVO. I know that you're down the road from me. They might exchange numbers, go out for a drink, have a chat. Suddenly the natural mentoring starts to appear. They come back after a break, and then the facilitator says, right, this next session is going to be psychoeducational. And what that means is we're all going to walk away having learned something. So the facilitator might pick something that emerged out the first half that's common to a few of the people. Or if there's nothing common, they might throw the question out to the room and say, is there anything in particular any of you guys would like to discuss? It might be 2 topics, might be 1, might be 5. And then there's a facilitated discussion where the facilitator makes sure that everyone inputs their thoughts around this. And so it's literally things like, Aldrin, what do you know about subject X? Have you experienced this yourself? What do you think? Or what do you think about what John shared a minute ago? So everyone gets to take part. And by the end of that session, you feel like you've learned something. It's very rare that people will walk away not having learned something new, because when there's 10 faces in the room or 10 heads in the room, you know, all of us are smarter than any one of us. And so there's an element of the first half, I got my stuff out. I feel de-stressed. I feel able to now have a bit of a social for 10 minutes. And then after, I've learned something. And the intent is that they learn something they can walk away with and either act on or think about in the following week until the next meeting. The last thing we do is called a checkout. And that's when we get to the end of the evening. It's a quick 5-minute round the room. Everyone once, one at a time. Could be done with a rock, or you just go around a circle. Give me 2 words. How did you feel coming in? How do you feel now? Or what did you learn from today? Or what are you going to work on this next week? But the point is that whichever technique you use, the facilitator uses it to assess, are you safe to get behind the wheel of a car? Because most people will say, I felt stressed, I felt traumatized, depressed, I feel elated, I feel re-energized. One guy will say, I was depressed and I'm still depressed. And that gives you the ability to, once the group's broken up, to go and approach that person individually and say, okay, do you need to speak to our helpline? Is there someone we could buddy you up with? We call it budding, but it's like mentoring with you guys, I guess. Do you need someone to talk to you again tomorrow? I mean, and at times when people have been highly distressed, which we've actually organized that a different dad speaks to them on the phone every single day. So that, you know, by the time they come around next week, they're still there with us and they suddenly feel loved, cared for. Their situation isn't as hopeless because they're learning something. There are approaches we can take. They don't feel isolated because there's others in exactly the same pool as me, and the suicidality just floats away. We now know from research that hopelessness and isolation in combination are 2 key factors. You address those 2, the suicidality just disappears, because men who are suicidal because of a situational distress situation versus chronic mental health, which is an underlying issue, medical issue, with situational distress, the minute you get it under control, you know, you're no longer in that situation where you're trying to balance, can I cope, can I not? I can't, therefore I'll take my life. I can cope. I've got a whole bunch of people who can help me through this. So suddenly I can. So I guess that's in a nutshell, that's how the groups operate. The online groups work exactly the same. Our helpline even operate in the same way. So an hour discussion on the helpline will almost be structured in that way, including, believe it or not, a break where they've been talking for an hour and they say, look, let's have a break, comfort break, back in 10 minutes, we'll chat again. And then it's educational. The first half being, I'm listening to you. I'm just listening. I'm not saying anything, so that you feel like you can talk. So what are the key things to take away that we've learned over the years that would apply to a mentor or to a group? The first is normalization. These guys quite often feel, I can't believe this is happening. This isn't normal. I've heard that people have difficulties, but my case is the worst on the planet. Knowing that their situation is quite normal for people in that situation actually makes a difference. I'm not alone. Second thing is a companionship, which links into that. There is someone I can talk to and say, I feel suicidal, or I've got voices in my head, or I was angry towards my kids, and not fear that that will be used against them in court. If you don't get it out, you're not dealing with it. And that's part of the problem. One of the issues we have in Australia is a very difficult and sad situation. It's called family annihilations. It's where somebody is so stressed and feels so cornered and isn't able to walk away or find comfort in activism or find comfort in forgiveness. They may actually take it out on the entire family and themselves. Everyone's heard the stories of an entire family wiped out in one go, and it happens. Mums do it, dads do it. And Australia has one of the highest rates in the Western world, believe it or not, and it's increasing. So there's something we're stressing these people too much, and we're not providing them the right outlets where they can actually just say, this is how I feel. Last thing is, so normalization, companionship, and the last thing is expectation. Quite often, the problem that we're dealing with is an inappropriate or erroneous sense of expectation. When I first went to the family court, a day or two after I came home and discovered everything had gone, I assumed that judge was going to sit there and go, yep, well, you haven't done anything wrong and this is unfair. You're going to get to see your kids in the next week. Everything will be fine. Well, it took over 10 years. If someone had told me that it was going to take me 10 years, I probably would have killed myself at that point because I was so distressed. But quite often the sense of expectation, this will get resolved because I'll do everything right, or I am a good person, I've not done anything knowingly, or I'll go on training or behavioral change programs and I'll give it my all, and it still doesn't deliver. It's almost like, unless they have an expectation, this will take 20 or 30 court visits, this will take a few years. You need to kind of be calm through it. You need to deal with evidence, not be emotional. Some of the things that came out of today's discussion. Once you set that expectation, people go, okay, I can deal with it. I don't like it, but I can deal with it. And we'll, as parents beyond breakup or as a mentor, I'll be there to hold your hand through this process. You'll be okay. And, you know, think about the fact that your children won't be children forever. There is a point at which none of this will apply. And yes, when they're 18, 19, 20, they can do whatever the hell they like. So think about the future. You know, worst case scenario, they'll become an adult and you'll still be their dad for the rest of their life. So managing expectation is super critical in this kind of situation. And I think that's kind of it in a nutshell. That's about the fastest I can kind of cover it off, but there's a lot more to it than that. I'm happy to take questions, happy to come back another time, go into detail.
And that's so valuable, Pete, to hear about these areas that you've mentioned here, normalizing companionship and sharing in a safe space, and then having the expectations, understanding the expectations, having somebody to explain that and keep that in check for you. Let's go to questions. Just give us a wave if you're ready to ask something for Pete around what you've heard this evening. Somebody has a question there?
I'll give you a quick one.
Yep, Adam, please, thanks. And thank you for sharing in the chat, Adam.
That's right. Is there any kind of simplified forms that can actually be given to males who are facing things like ABOs? And because I know when I was going through it, nobody knew, including the police, what the laws were, what you were allowed to do, what you weren't allowed to do. And it just got very confusing. I think if there was some kind of simplified, because they hand you a whole heap of law documents, the court documents, and they're useless to you or I, and it just gets very confusing.
There's a bunch of lawyers around the country who've actually put a little bit of effort in and on a pro bono basis and produced various leaflets and stuff. And we do share that with the dads that come to us depending on their need. It's a really good challenge though, because we ought to put that on our website publicly so that everyone can find it. Because when you need it fast. We also do workshops every once in a while, which we record and then we make it available to all the dads through our various support groups. But yeah, putting some of those out publicly would be useful. I agree though. It's one of those situations where you need really simple stuff just to say, this is what you do, this is what you don't do.
Well, I was coming across police that didn't even know what you could do and what you couldn't do.
Yeah. It's a really weird. AVOs, DVOs, IVOs are really weird. They're not criminal, but they're not civil either. They kind of sit in this no man's land between the two. I think police sometimes struggle with them, and there are different types as well. In terms of what you can and can't do. And then there's the difficulty of, well, if they don't name the child, are you allowed to see the child? And if they name the child, why have they named the child if you've never actually done anything to the child? It gets horribly complex. It's messy as hell. So yeah, it's difficult. We do have a few barristers who specialize in this, and they will look after mums and dads who are facing an AVO for free instantly. But again, you need to come through us. Otherwise, if we put their details out in the public, everyone would flood them.
Yeah, and presumably, Pete, it's thank you for the question, Adam. It's a really practical question and a valuable one because of as you've described, people, even the people who are have to enforce the law don't understand it. But again, Pete, it's probably something that will change state to state as well, which makes it even more complex to manage. But your website is a good place to start.
Yeah, I mean, there's also the challenge that the domestic, I mean, it falls under the domestic violence team within the police, and from area to area, they have different policies around when they issue them, when they don't, and therefore how it's interpreted. It's horribly complex. There are different types within the state. There are different mechanisms to achieve it, and how you achieved it determine how it's enforced. And then there are different police officers who handle them differently. Then you've got different states on top of it. It is messy as hell. It is, and I wish they would clean it up. I really do.
I don't know whether it's worthwhile, but you mentioned before about the hesitation for. I mean, I guess it applies to anyone, but certainly for men to go and approach their doctor. About either how they're feeling, what thoughts they might have, knowing about mandatory reporting and the potential for having records subpoenaed and that sort of thing. I guess I'm still curious to know obviously, if you're talking to a lawyer, you've got that that privilege to be able to speak to them and know that it can't go anywhere else. I'm just curious, how does any of that sort of play out in this sort of environment here? I mean, obviously these are recorded sessions for one thing, but even if they weren't, if they were just chats, where do you stand? Like, could the court turn around and say, well, we know you've been attending these, we're going to go and have a chinwag to them? I don't know.
Well, we actually, you mean when someone turns up at one of our groups?
Yeah.
Okay, so part of our introduction is that we say, look, if you say something that concerns us in this room, we may need to speak to someone else if we're concerned that you might cause harm to yourself or others. But before I do that, I will come to speak to you first. And that the very fact that you share that tends to provide confidence in the room that at least they're going to know you're not going to run off behind their back and report them to police. That's interesting. I mean, the second piece is that it's very rare that we actually have to do that. It's very rare that you have to do that. And part of it is because as a peer support group, this is one of the beauties of a peer support group, we are men who've gone through it, so we understand what it's like to go through it. So just to give you a quick example of what I mean by that, I've been in a room facilitating where a man has come in and he started talking, and then he started crying, and then he's hit there was a little table there. He smacked it really hard, and he started getting angry. And what was really curious to me was looking around the room, nobody was getting distressed by this because we all knew what he was going through. He was not angry at us. He was angry at the situation. He was letting his emotions out. No one felt that he was a risk to himself, anyone in the room, or outside. And so our interpretation of that is very different from another organization that might go, whoa, imagine doing that in front of your GP and smacking a table in front of the GP and saying, I'm F this, I'm F that, I'm sick of it, I'm being accused of all these things. So there's a lot of interpretation going on. We're not aware of any case of a guy that's been to us that's ended up with some sort of adverse incident outside. We're not aware of it, but we have changed our policy to say if we're concerned, we'll come and speak to you first before we go anywhere else. It wouldn't stop us speaking to someone externally if we're concerned, genuinely concerned. In the few occasions it's happened with me, the individual has said, look, I was just angry, I no intention, I'm not going to do anything, I'm fine. And we've generally followed up to make sure they're okay. So fingers crossed, so far it's never been a problem. And everything that's said in the room stays in the room, and there's no recording. 100% no recording. We have thrown people out for secretly recording the groups. We've thrown people out of our online groups where they've taken screenshots and we've discovered it. We use platforms where the data shared is actually ours as an organization. So for example, if you were to share something on a Facebook group, that belongs to Facebook. If I took a screenshot of your comments on there, you couldn't do anything about it without forcing Facebook to sue them. In our case, if we're aware that somebody shared your comment, we'll be taking them to court for theft and prosecuting them, getting them actually prosecuted. So that we explain all this when you join our forums and say, do not share anything. It's about as secure as it can get, but it's not perfect. It's not perfect.
We have one last question. Graham, you had two questions. Graham and then John. Graham, you have something there, and you're going to go back to something that tapped into the chat a little while ago about some men not knowing the help is there, but still rejecting it.
Yeah, that's right, John. On our website, see, we refer people to Parents Beyond Breakup all the time. And it's great that the organization's there. Hopefully after today we can get even closer and know how to do that even more seamlessly for people. But if anyone in this call knows someone who is in distress by this topic, and I know this is the type of thing you hear all the time, if anyone sees this program and is disturbed, ring Lifeline. What we can do, if you go to the Mentoring Men website, you can actually refer somebody. There's a referral form there directly on the website, as long as they have given you permission for us to call them. If they've given you permission for us to call them, we do actually prefer that to be by text, but even if it's verbal, there's a place to put that on the form. We will call the man and ask him if it's a convenient time for us to call. We'll say that, John Ogier gave us your number. He told us that we had permission to call you. We understand you're doing it tough. Have you got time to talk, or do you want me to call back later? So that's a proactive service. Through that, we will actually refer men, obviously, to Parents Beyond Breakup, and or get them a mentor, and or hold their hand through the process so that they're getting whatever help they need. So that's one of the points of difference of Mentoring Men compared to those other services. We will reach out to the men concerned. Obviously, the forms are there on the website. I've put my mobile phone out there as well in case you need me to walk you through that process. But this is definitely the organisation for men going through breakup and women. It's fantastic, and it's really about making sure people feel that any labelling that they feel are joining this group will disappear far after they're enjoying the benefits of belonging.
That just about everyone that you will ever speak to at Parents Beyond Breakup is a peer. Whether it's a mum or a dad that's calling us or contacting us, it's always a mum or dad that's gone through it that they will talk to. We're very, very strong on that. I mean, the only jobs you can be in at PBB without being a peer are back office jobs that will never speak to a client ever. So that's one of the ways we say, look, you are 100% safe. Yep, you might think there's nothing that can be done, but you're speaking to another dad who's gone through it 10 years before you. And generally that reduces the barrier down a little bit, but no different from you guys. If you're a peer mentor, it's exactly the same.
Very good. That's good learning for us as we as Mentoring Men starts to develop and grow, obviously we're growing to support the need out there, and these kind of experiences that you have had at PBB are just so vital for us too. Thanks, Pete. And last question tonight is going to John. John,
last word again. How cool is that? Hey, thank you, gentlemen. Thank you, Pete. Just a thought: parents beyond borders or boundaries, breakup. Sorry, yeah, parents. There are a whole bunch of men who go through breakups who aren't parents.
Yeah.
So, but I can't imagine you exclude them.
No, we don't. You can be gay, straight, have kids, not have kids, be married, not be married. And the really curious thing which surprised me was one of the first groups I ran in Sydney, a gay man turned up who wasn't married and didn't have kids. And I was curious when he turned up how the others were going to react. Everyone just accepted him, just like he's in as much as distress as the rest of us. He's no different. It's really astonishing when it's almost like being in the military and going to war together, or going through some big disaster. You have something in common. Every other factor just goes out the window, and it's natural.
It's the number one rapport thing. Suffering is the number one rapport.
Exactly.
Element. Yeah.
And it happens naturally. I mean, the way we train our facilitators as well, the reason we went from 50 groups to 20 was because we learned what worked and what didn't work, and what does good service look like. And one of them is the environment and the culture that a facilitator creates. And if they weren't up to scratch, then they were kind of moved on and allowed to do their own thing in another name. But yeah, culture is really important. It's very inclusive. We don't judge. Women turn up to the dads groups. We ask the other guys if they're happy that there's a lady in the room, then there's a lady in the room. But our rule is opposite gender is allowed in only if all the others have been asked and they don't have a problem with it. But we've never had a group turn around and say no.
Fabulous. Great. So just on that, one observation, your website has a separation checklist. So Adam, you might want to check that one out, because that's got quite a lot of really useful practical information on it. So you guys are already a good source of info. But ultimately, I was just wondering, the peer support model, which works so well for you and is working for us and so on. How are we going to establish this as the initial and most important kind of response, rather than first responders, rather than medical frameworks, rather than pathologizing situational pain, right, or distress? Do you have a thought around that, mate?
A couple. That's a really deep question, actually. I do have some thoughts on it. Just to keep it short, I suppose. We've had, I guess I go to all the suicide prevention conferences. I go to the various meetings and I talk occasionally and talk about our performance, talk to major universities, etc. There is a definite shift in accepting that situational distress as a major driver of suicide is real, but it hasn't been fully adopted. I mean, I think the example one academic gave to me said, do you realize that when we discovered that the Earth wasn't flat, it took 400 years for pretty much every scientist to actually accept it, even though you could logically prove it. And I think the issue is the same here. I think the timelines are a little bit more compressed now, but we've been talking about situational distress for at least 10 years. But if you compare now to 10 years ago, there's probably a couple of hundred white papers about it. So what does that mean? It means that if you look at who do men go to, and who men go to is based on trust. So there's a nice piece of research out there. I can't remember who did it. It's commissioned by Lifeline, which is if you're looking for help, I think it was Lifeline, I could be wrong. If you're looking for help, who do you go to? Well, it was peers and GPs. So we started looking at, okay, we listed off recently in a survey we did about 3 months ago, here are all the major organizations that you might go to for help as a separated man. Which one of these do you trust? And we were astonished that we were top of the list. Well, that doesn't astonish us. What a surprise. We're dads in distress.
Yeah.
Where the hell else would dads in distress go? The number 2 was GPs, but after that, it was Lifeline, Beyond Blue, but significantly down. And then beyond that, it was almost down to 0. It's really interesting. So what we deduced from that was the trust levels are lower in the big charities, but given that we are small and we don't have the financial clout to reach everyone and educate everyone, maybe the best thing we can do is actually to tie up with the big boys like Lifeline, Beyond Blue, and educate their telephone staff, their practitioners in every local community, because they will be coming across lots and lots of these guys that both of our organizations would deal with, and they just need to trust that we actually know what the hell we're doing. That is slowly improving. One of the things we're looking to do for Southwest Sydney, and it's a discussion we still need to have as two organizations on that particular project, but we're looking to do a couple of information briefings, like 15 minutes one evening every week for any practitioner, whether it's a GP, whether it's a police officer, court official, or a doctor, whatever, where they can just turn up. We'll record them, and then we're going to stick them up on the website so they know, okay, well, who the hell are you? Do you actually know what you're doing? Why should we refer people to you? We reckon that education is probably the best way to get those referrals into us. I don't think, quite honestly, we're just not going to get the money, and you'd need millions to be able to be the first point of call. It would cost more money than we've got. And I actually feel honored to be amongst men who are going out their way and doing something. So you're all lifesavers. You may not always know it, but trust me, you are. So you're in my good books.